into the dark and eerie world of Edgar Allan Poe, let's take a moment to reflect on the life of this extraordinary writer, whose haunting words have captivated readers for generations. Born in 1809, Poe lived through an intense, often troubled life marked by hardship, loss, and a search for meaning. His work, from chilling tales of horror to melancholic poetry, drew deeply from his own experiences and his fascination with the mysterious. Often called the master of Gothic literature, Poe's influence shaped modern horror, detective fiction, and the supernatural in ways we still feel today. So today, as we read and reflect on his works, let's keep in mind the complex mind behind these enduring tales, a man whose words remained with us of the beauty, fear, and mystery woven into the human experience. Today we will have three performances: the oblong box, the oval portrait, and the telltale heart. Our first performance will be the oval portrait.
Okay.
Mr. Barrera, a few words from Mr. Barrera before we begin.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is live theater. In live theater, there's something called etiquette. And in etiquette comes respect of the performers, because they are here to entertain you. So please, the only things that are working are your eyes and your ears. Your mouth no longer works. So please, pay attention. Enjoy the entertainment. Turn off your phones. No bathroom breaks, because it will interrupt the performer. And maybe, just maybe, as you're walking out, I might be waiting around the corner, and I will scare you. Now, enjoy the performances. Please be respectful to your performers, and enjoy the show.
Ladies and gentlemen, our first story is The Oval Portrait. Story of a man that breaks into a mansion, seeking refuge. But once he's there, is he truly alone? Or are there entities within? It is also a story about vanity and pride, and the consequences that come with our obsession with beauty. So without further ado, The Oval Portrait. The chateau into which my valet had ventured to make forcible entry, rather than permit me, in my desperately wounded condition, to pass a night in the open air, was one of those piles of commingled gloom and grandeur which have so long frowned among the Apennines. Not less, in fact, than the fancy of Mrs. Radcliffe. To my appearance, it had been temporarily and very lately abandoned. We established ourselves in one of the smallest and least sumptuously furnished apartments. It lay in a remote turret, one of the buildings. Its decorations were rich, yet tattered and antique. Its walls were hung with tapestry and bedecked with manifold and multifold emerald trophies, together with an unusually great number of very spirited modern paintings in frames of rich golden arabesque. In these paintings, which depended from the walls not only in their main surfaces, but in very many nooks, which in the bizarre architecture of the chateau rendered necessary. In these paintings, my incipient delirium perhaps had caused me, already night, to light the tongues of the tall candelabrum which stood by the head of my bed, and to throw open far and wide the fringed curtains of black velvet which enveloped the bed itself. I wished all this done that I might resign myself, if not to sleep, at least alternate to the contemplation of these paintings, these pictures, and the perusal of a small volume which had been found upon the pillow, and which purported to criticize and describe these paintings. Long I read, and devoutly and devotedly I gazed, Rapidly and gloriously the hours flew by, and the deep midnight finally came. The position of the candelabrum displeased me, and outreaching my hand with difficulty rather than disturbing my slumbering valet, I placed it so as to throw its rays more fully upon the book. But the action produced an altogether unanticipated effect. The rays of the numerous candles, for there were many, now fell within the niche of the room, which had hitherto been thrown into the deep shade by one of the bedposts. I thus saw in vivid light a picture all unnoticed before. It was the portrait of a young girl, just ripening into womanhood. I glanced at the painting hurriedly and closed my eyes. Why did I? It was not the first apparent even to my first perception, but while my lids remained thus shut, I ran over in my mind my reason for shutting them in the first place. It was an impulsive movement to gain time for thought, to make sure that my vision had not deceived me, to calm and subdue my fancy for a more sober and more certain gaze. In a very few moments, I again looked fixedly at the painting. That I now saw aright I could not and would not doubt. For the first flashing of the candles upon that canvas had seemed to dissipate the dreamy stupor which was stealing over my senses, and to startle me at once into waking life. The portrait, I have already said, was that of a young girl. It was a mere head and shoulders, done in what is technically termed as a vignette manner, much in the style of the favored heads of Sully. The arms, the bosom, and even the ends of the radiant hair melted imperceptibly into the vague yet deep shadow which formed the background of the whole. The frame was oval, richly gilded, and filigreed and Moresque. As a thing of art, nothing could be more admirable than the painting itself. But it could have been neither the execution of the work nor the immortal beauty of the countenance which had so suddenly and so vehemently moved me. Least of all could it have been that my fancy, shaken from its half-slumber, had mistaken the head of that of a living person. Is she alive? I don't know. I saw at once that the peculiarities of the design, of the vignetting, of the frame, must have instantly dispelled such idea, must have prevented even its momentary entertainment. Thinking earnestly upon these points, I remained for an hour perhaps, half sitting, half reclining, with my vision riveted upon the portrait. At length, satisfied with the true secret of its effect, I fell back into the bed. I had found the spell of the picture in an absolute likeliness of expression, which, at first startling, finally confounded, subdued, and appalled me. With deep and reverent awe, I replaced the candelabrum in its former position. The cause of my deep agitation being thus shut from view, I sought eagerly the volume which discussed the paintings and their histories. Turning to the number which designated the oval portrait, I there read the vague and quaint words which follow. She was a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee. The evil was the hour when she saw and loved and wedded the painter. He, passionate, studious, austere, and having already a bride in his art, she, a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee, all light and smiles, and frolicsome of the young fawn, loving and cherishing all things, hating only the art which was her rival, dreading only the palette and the brushes and other untoward instruments which deprived her of the countenance of her lover. It was thus a terrible thing for this lady to hear the painter speak of his desire to portray even his young bride. But she was this lady to hear the painter speak of his desire to paint her. She was humble and obedient, and sat meekly for many weeks in the dark, high turret chamber, where the high dripped upon the pale canvas only from overhead. But he, the painter, took glory in his work, which went from hour to hour, from day to day, from week to week. He was as passionate and as wild as a moody man, who became lost in reveries, so that he could not see the light which fell so ghastly in that lone turret, withering the health and spirits of his bride, who pined visibly, all but for him. Yet she still smiled, on and on complainingly, because she saw that the painter, her husband, who had high renown, took a fervent and burning passion in his art in this task, and wrought the day and night to depict her who so loved him, yet who grew daily more and more dispirited and weak. And in sooth, some who beheld the portrait spoke of its resemblance in low words, as of a mighty marvel, and a proof not less of the power of the painter than of his deep love for her, whom he depicted so surpassingly well. But at length, as the labor drew near to its conclusion, there was admitted none into the turret. No one could come in, for the painter had grown wild with the ardor of his work, and he turned his eyes from the canvas, merely even to regard the countenance of his wife. And he would not see that the tints which he spread upon the canvases were drawn from the cheeks of her own saints beside him. And when many weeks had passed, and but little remained to do, save one brush upon the mouth, one tint upon the eye, the spirit of the lady again flickered up as the flame within the socket of the lamp. And when the brush had given, and when the tint was placed, and for one moment the painter stood entranced before the work which he had wrought. And in the next, while yet he gazed, he grew tremulous and very pallid and aghast, and crying with a loud voice, he said, "This is indeed life itself!" He turned suddenly to regard his beloved. She was dead.
For my performance, I will not give you a preview of the story. Because this story, it is up to you, and you alone, to figure out what is happening, what is going on. The oblong box. Some years ago, I went on a ship voyage from Charleston, South Carolina, to the city of New York, in a fine packet ship known as Independence. And it was manned by Captain Hardy. We were to sail on June 15th, weather permitting. Thus, on the 14th of June, I went on board to arrange some matters in my stateroom. I found that we were to have a great many passengers, including a more than usual number of ladies. On the list were several of my acquaintances, and among other names, I was rejoiced to see that of Mr. Cornelius Wyatt, a young artiste, an artist for whom I had a warm friendship with. He was to be on the ship. He and I had been fellow students at the same university, and we were very much always together. He had the ordinary mood of a genius, and I had a huge dislike for humankind. And yet, he still had that sensibility and an enthusiasm. I observed that his name was listed next to 3 staterooms. And upon referring to the list of passengers, I found that he had engaged passage for himself, his wife, and his 2 sisters. The staterooms were sufficiently roomy. Each had 2 beds, one above the other. And these beds, to be sure, were so exceedingly narrow as to be insufficient for more than one person. Yet still, I cannot comprehend why there were 3 staterooms for these 4 persons. It was no business of mine, to be sure, but with nonetheless intrigue did I occupy myself in attempts to resolve the mystery. Why so many rooms? At last I reached a conclusion that I had not arrived at before. It's a servant, of course, I said. What a fool I am. Not sooner to have thought of it, such an obvious reason. So then again, I looked at the list. But here I saw distinctly that no servant was to come to this party. Although in fact, it had been the original design to bring one, for the words "and servant" had been first written, but then were scratched off. Oh. It's the extra baggage, to be sure, I now said to myself. Something he wishes not to put in the holding area below. Something to be kept under his own eye. I have it. It's an artiste. It's an artist. It's a painting or so. And that is what he's been bargaining about with Nicolino, the Italian Jew. This idea satisfied me. And I dismissed my curiosity for the moment. Wyatt's two sisters I knew very well. They were most amiable and clever girls, they were. He had a newlywed to his wife, but I had never seen her before. He had often talked about her in my presence, however, and in his usual style of enthusiasm, too. He described her as an unsurpassing beauty, unsurpassing wit and accomplishment. I was therefore quite anxious to make her acquaintance. On the day in which I visited the ship, remember, the 14th, Wyatt and his party were also to visit. So the captain informed me, and I waited on board an hour longer than I had designed in hope of being presented to the bride. But then an apology came. My friend stated, Mrs. Wyatt is a little indisposed, sick, and she won't be coming on board until tomorrow at our sailing. So then Captain Hardy met me and said, owing to circumstances, we will not sail for another day or two. And once everything's ready, I'll send up and let you know. This I thought was strange. But finally, the day of our voyage had arrived. I arrived to see my friend, Mr. Wyatt. As usual, he was somber. I was too well used to his behavior, to his attitude, to pay any special attention to it. I was there to see his wife. But it's strange, though. He did not even introduce me to his wife. This courtesy, instead, was coming from his sister. A very sweet and intelligent girl, who in a few hurried words made us acquainted. Mr. Wyatt, this is Wyatt, this is... But finally, when I saw Mrs. Wyatt, she had been closely veiled. And when she raised her veil, in acknowledging my bow, I confess that I was very profoundly astonished. I should have been much more so, however, had not long experience advised me not to trust and rely on the enthusiastic descriptions of my friend, the artist, when indulging in the comments of the loveliness of his wife. When beauty was the theme, I well knew with what facility he soared into the regions of purely ideal. She The truth is, I cannot help regarding Mrs. Wyatt as decidedly plain looking of a woman. It's absolutely true if I were to say she was positively ugly. She was dressed, however, in exquisite rich taste. And I had no doubt that she had captivated my friend's heart by the more enduring graces of, he fell in love with her intellect, her soul. She said very few words and passed at once into her stateroom with Mr. Wyatt. My old investigative mind now returned. There was no servant. That was a settled point. So I looked, therefore, for the extra baggage. Where is the extra baggage? And after some delay, a cart arrived at the wharf with an oblong pine box. Which was everything that seemed to be expected. But immediately upon its arrival, we made sail. And in a short time, we were safely over the bar and standing out into open sea. The box in question was, as I say, oblong. It was about 6 feet in length by 2.5 in breadth. And I observed it attentively. Now this shape was peculiar. And no sooner had I seen it that I took upon myself to investigate. I had reached a conclusion. It will well be remembered that the extra baggage of my friend the artist would prove to be maybe pictures, or at least a picture, for I knew he had been for several weeks in conference with Nicolino. And now here was a box, which from its shape could possibly contain nothing in the world but a copy of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And perhaps a copy of this very Last Supper, done by Rubini the Younger at Florence. I had known for some time to be in the possession of Nicolino. At this point, therefore, I considered and sufficiently settled. Yes, it's pictures in the box. I chuckled excessively when I thought of my solution to the mystery. Got it. It was the first time I had ever known Wyatt to keep from me any of his artistic secrets. But here he did keep this one from me and smuggled a fine picture to New York under my very nose, expecting me to know nothing of the matter. I decided I was going to quiz him on it, now and hereafter. However, one thing annoyed me quite a bit. The box did not go into the extra room. It was deposited in Wyatt's own room, and there too it remained, occupying very nearly the whole floor. No doubt to the exceeding discomfort of the artist, his wife, the box in one room. Something else. The box that was in there, it was sprawling with capital letters. It emitted a strong smell. Disagreeable. Peculiarly, a disgusting odor. Ooh. And on the lid, it was painted, Mrs. Adelaide Curtis, Albany, New York, the charge of Cornelius' wife. This side up to be handled with care. Now, I was aware that Mrs. Adelaide Curtis of Albany was the artist wife's mother. So my mind yet again began to wander. The passengers were consequently in high spirits and disposed to be social, except for, however, Wyatt and his sisters. They behaved stiffly, and I could not help but thinking they were being uncourteous to the rest of the group. Wyatt's conduct I did not much mind. He was always gloomy. But this was beyond his usual habit. The sisters secluded themselves in their staterooms during the greater part of the voyage and absolutely refused, although I repeatedly urged them, to hold communication with any of the people on board. Mrs. Wyatt herself, however, was more agreeable. This is to say, she was chatty. And to be chatty is no slight recommendation at sea. She became excessively intimate with most of the ladies, and to my profound astonishment, she was even flirting with the men. She amused us all very much. And I say amused and scarcely know how to explain myself. The truth is, I soon found that Mrs. Wyatt was far more often laughed at than laughed with. The gentlemen said little about her, but the ladies, in a little while, pronounced her a good-hearted thing. Rather unfortunate looking, totally uneducated, and very, very vulgar. The great wonder was how Wyatt had been convinced to marry her. He is so refined, so intelligent, so fastidious, exquisite, rich. He has an appreciation for all that is beautiful. To be sure, the lady seemed especially fond of him, particularly so in his absence, when she would say words like, "Oh, my beloved husband. Oh, Mr. Wyatt, my husband forever." The word husband seemed forever, to use one of her own delicate expressions, forever on the tip of her tongue. In the meantime, it was observed by all on board the ship that he avoided her in the most obvious manner. And for the most part, he shut himself up alone in his stateroom, where in fact, he might have been said to live altogether, leaving his wife at full liberty to amuse herself as she thought best in the public society of the main cabin. My conclusion was, and what I had heard was, that the artist, by some unaccountable freak of fate, or perhaps in some fit of enthusiastic or fanciful passion, had been convinced to unite himself with a person altogether beneath him. And that the natural result, entire and speedy, was that he felt disgust and regret. I pitied him from the bottom of my heart, but could not for that reason quite forgive his secrecy about hiding the Last Supper in the oblong box in his stateroom. For this, I resolved to have my revenge for his secrecy. So one day, when he came upon deck, shaking his arm, I decided to talk to him. But he was moody. And I ventured a joke or two. Hey, oh no. He made a sickening attempt at a smile. Yeah. Poor fellow, as I thought of his wife. I wondered if he could have the heart to put at least a little bit semblance of happiness. When I asked about the oblong box in his room with his wife, they laughed hysterically. They offered no words, just secrecy. I was determined to find out what was going on with him and what was the peculiar shape of that box. For 2 days, after speaking with my friend and him acting all strange, I decided to take matters into my own hands. That night, I could see into the after cabin quite distinctly, and just at that portion of it too, where the staterooms of Mr. Wyatt were. And so for 2 nights, not consecutive, for 2 nights, I clearly saw Mrs. Wyatt. About 11 o'clock every night, she cautiously went from the stateroom with her husband and walked into the empty extra room every night. She remained there until daybreak. Then in the morning, she was called back by her husband and went back to the room with him. Guess what? They were virtually separated. They had separate apartments, no doubt in contemplation of divorce. And here, after all I thought, was still the mystery of what's in the oblong box that was still in his room. After listening to them for some time with thoughtful attention, I at length succeeded perfectly in translating the meanings. I was going to cautiously start listening to his stateroom when he was there. There were sounds. It was like an artist. The artist was prying open and once. Chisel, mallet. The latter being apparently muffled or deadened by some soft woolen or cotton substance in which the head was enveloped. And in this manner, I fancied I could distinguish the precise moment when he, the artist, my friend, Mr. White, he opened the lid. And I could hear, determine, when he removed it altogether and deposited it upon the lower bed of his room. After this, there was dead stillness. And I heard nothing more upon either occasion until nearly daybreak. Unless perhaps I may mention, I think I heard sobbing. Or a murmuring sound? Oh, indeed. Indeed, the whole latter noise, it was not produced by imagination. I could hear what resembled sobbing. But of course, it could not have been either. You know what? No, maybe it was. It's ringing in my ears. At the end of this period, however, suddenly the wind that was outside freshened and turned into a hurricane. We were now sailing in a hurricane. To add to our dilemma, we found that the water pumps were choked and nearly useless. The ship was being ripped apart by the winds. All was now confusion and despair, but an effort was made to lighten the ship by throwing overboard as much of her cargo as we could, by cutting away things that were unnecessary. This we at last accomplished, but we were still unable to do anything about the water pumps, and the leak gained on very fast. And at sundown, the wind gale had sensibly diminished into violent winds, and as the sea went up and down, so did the ship. And at 8 p.m. the clouds broke away to the windward, and we had the advantage of the full moon, a piece of good fortune which served us wonderfully to cheer our drooping spirits. And after incredible labor, we succeeded in lowering some longboats over the side without material accident. And into these we crowded the whole of the crew and most of the passengers. This party made off immediately, and after undergoing much suffering, finally arrived in safety to shore. And on the third day after the wreck, 14 passengers with the captain remained on board, resolving to trust their fortunes to the jolly boat at the stern. We lowered it immediately, although it was only by a miracle that we prevented from swamping as it touched the water. It contained, when afloat, the captain, his wife, Mr. White and his party, a Mexican officer, his wife, 4 children, myself, and a Negro valet. We had no room, of course, for anything else. No one had thought of even attempting to bring anything else. And then all of a sudden, for no reason, my friend sprang up from the lifeboat and screamed, "Save the oblong box!" Captain Hardy. "Sit down, Mr. Wyatt," replied the captain, somewhat sternly. "You will capsize us if you do not sit quite still." "The box!" screamed Mr. Wyatt, still standing. "The box, I say! Captain Hardy, you will not refuse me. Its weight is but a trifle. It's nothing, mere nothing. By the mother who bore you, by the love of heaven, by hope of salvation, I implore you, go back for the box." The captain for a moment seemed touched by the earnest appeal of the artist, but he remained stern. "Mr. White, you are mad. I cannot listen to you. Sit down, I say, or you will swamp the boat. No, hold him! Seize him! Oh!" Mr. White, in fact, sprang from the boat, and as it were, went into the sea. And in some sort of superhuman exertion, he found a rope hanging from the ship, and in another moment, he was aboard the sinking ship and rushing frantically down the cabin. In the meantime, we had been swept astern. The boat was like a feather in the breath. But we saw at a glance our friend, the madman, had emerged with the oblong box. We gazed at extreme astonishment. He turned the rope around the oblong box, and then he threw it over. Did you observe, Captain, how suddenly they sank? Shh, hush. Don't talk about the deceased. So we landed, finally, 4 days later. At that point, I finally met up with the captain, and the captain said to me, "What is going on? What happened?" And Captain Hardy said the following: "Well, the oblong box contained salt, and underneath the salt was the corpse of your friend's wife." "Well, then who was the other lady?" "Oh, that was his servant, pretending to be a wife. Because, see, you can't travel with a dead body on a ship with the living. So, eventually, once the salt dissolves, their bodies will rise." The end.